Kendy Howard. Kendy Howard was fun. She was communicative and engaged in her life, said her family, said her friends. She loved her parents, her brother, she loved her children, and especially her granddaughter. She had hobbies, passions, things in her life that brought her joy. And in the months before Kendy Howard's death, Kendy was moving towards something. She was moving towards a new future, a new house, a new relationship, a new life that was away from the financial, emotional, and psychological control of the defendant. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Throughout this case, the state has shown you that Kendy Howard did not kill herself. Kendy Howard did not kill herself because Kendy Howard was full of life, moving towards that future. And Kendy Howard did not kill herself because Kendy Howard was dead when she was shot through the mouth. The defendant killed Kendy Howard. Now, back in July of 2020, Kendy was very much still under the financial control of the defendant. And on this particular day, they were, once again, arguing about money. As Michelle Lampert told you, Dan's money was Dan's money, and Kendy's money was Dan's money. And messages between Kendy and the defendant on that day tell us that they were, in fact, fighting about money. "Now I'm pissed," he says. She would later confirm with Dan Prado that the fight was about money and that it got to a blowout point. Later that evening, she would call 911 frantic and terrified. She would tell that 911 operator that she heard something, a shot, but that she doesn't know guns. Later, when law enforcement did arrive, she would not report anything. And who was standing next to her? Her son, Wyatt. She didn't report in front of her son. But she does tell the next day. She is texting, communicative as always, with her friend, Michelle Lampert. And you can read these entire conversations. They're available to you. She sends her these bruise photos as well. She shares it with Dan Prado as well, talking about how this happened and implying who did it. Talks to Dan Prado about being made to erase her phone. Because as Ms. Marhopper, the prosecutor investigator, told you, Kendy liked to take selfies. There were a lot of selfies on her phone, and we have some from this time period. That one of her ear was taken at 8:25 p.m. on July 10th. And then there were the photos that were on her phone that she didn't send. She took lots of bruise photos. Photos to her chest, to the front of her arm, to the back of her arm, to her other arm on the other side, underneath her arm, and to her neck. And Kendy didn't share these photos. She took them. And these are dated July 12th. Now, in order for the defendant to be found guilty of count 1 domestic battery, the state must prove several things. On or about the 10th day of July, that's when Kendy says it happened that evening. In the state of Idaho, their home in Athol, the defendant committed a battery upon Kendy Howard, causing injuries to her. And certainly in those conversations, they were household members, they were still living together and married at the time, and in doing so inflicted a traumatic injury. All of those bruises on every part of Kendy's chest, under the arm, on the side, those weren't made from slipping on a trolling motor. It is convenient that the defendant's they saw Kendy slip on the trolling motor. But again, those photos from inside of Kendy's phone, they don't match that timeline. Because Kendy and Dan pulled the boat out and went to Dworshak on July 15th, 5 days after this event. The bruise, seen in pictures at Dworshak, it's fading. This happened on July 10th, and it didn't happen from slipping. Maybe slipping might explain that one on the chest that was visible to other people, but it doesn't explain all those other bruises. Now, Dr. Bostack testified, and she talked to you about all of the reasons that victims of domestic violence do not report, why they don't report to law enforcement, and why they don't share details with their family, with their friends, why they stay in relationships where they are ridiculed, where they have mean comments said to them, where they are controlled, isolated, and abused. Brooke took the stand. She told you things that she's heard her stepfather say to her mother. Things like fat, bitch, dumb. But what did change in July is that Kendy got serious about leaving. She started talking with her coworkers. And Kendy did share with her coworkers because Kendy was communicative. Like how she told her coworker Matt Kulak. She didn't get that bruise at work. But she starts talking to him about how she's going to be leaving that job. She's going to be leaving her job of many years, and she's moving to Kendy. And she's asking her bosses for references and to look at job postings. And she's talking to her friends about maybe she's not going to stay with the hospital. Maybe she's going to follow her passions, open up a little antique store. And Kendy is working with her boyfriend, who was a realtor, to look at houses down in Kamei. And on January 22nd, her offer on that house in Kamei was accepted. She signed paperwork, entered into a contract, and even back on January 22nd, she was getting advice from Dan Prado that she would have to get a quitclaim deed. She was communicating about this, she was asking questions, she was getting that information that she needed. She was also talking with her friends about this idea that she's going to leave Dan Howard. She's telling them about her feelings. She's sharing. She's engaged with her friends and her family. And what's more, she's supported. Her friends are telling her, you know that we'll support you. You know that you've got somewhere to go if shit gets bad. And Kendy, she's excited. January 24th, she is out shopping. She's getting to choose decor for the house that's going to be all hers. She's getting the hot tub that she's always wanted. She's getting to make those purchases for her future. And yes, we know again from Kendy's phone, Kendy was having thoughts. She was wondering about things. There's a screenshot, never sent in her phone, saying why not agree to just keep each other's own pension? Only one person she would have sent that to. But Kendy wasn't a person to keep her thoughts just in her mind. Kendy sought out information. Like on January 26th, Kendy reaches out to her friend Zach Jones. Says, hey, how much is my house worth? How much are those lots in Spirit Lake worth? And even talking with him about how she knows she's going to have to get something written up for the new house in Kamei. And maybe also talking to him about some of her fears. But that isn't where Kendy stopped. January 27th, Kendy met with Matt Briggs, the attorney. And in that period of time, Kendy found out that she was entitled to the $2 million in community property that they had. She would be entitled to half. Half of the house in Apple, half of the lots in Spirit Lake, all of the toys that they had accumulated over the course of their 26-year marriage, half of the retirement accounts, including Dan's retirement account, and cash. Because Kendy was seeking out that information. She was getting informed and she was sharing that information that she was learning with her mom, with her friends. January 28th, Kendy does something for her. On that day, she goes and she makes an appointment for a mommy makeover. January 28th, she makes that appointment. But that appointment is set for later in February. Because as we know, Kendy had some body image issues, likely fueled by the abuse that she had sustained in her marriage from her husband. She had been on diet pills that she'd gotten from Dr. Ford, her family doctor, as well as from Kristen Miller at the Real Weight Loss Clinic. But Kendy was moving forward, looking forward, making those future plans. And during this time, Dan's up in Alaska, and he's getting bits and pieces of this, and they're starting to text and talk about it, and he says, we can talk about this when I get home. On January 28th, Kendy goes and picks him up from the airport, drives to Spokane, picks him up. And Kendy, ever communicative, is talking with her childhood friend Tana. She's telling Tana on the 28th, I asked for a divorce. Tana says, what's his reaction? And he says, not good. But despite that, Kendy tells Tana, when Tana asks, how do you feel? She says, never felt so good. That feeling did not last for Kendy, because Kendy went to bed. And then the next morning, early in the morning hours of the 29th, she woke up. She woke up to the defendant standing over her in black or dark colored clothes, wearing black latex gloves, holding something in his hand that was probably like a pillow. His other hand she couldn't see. Kendy saw a look in his eyes that terrified her. She opened up a line to Dan Prado. She managed to get to the bathroom, and what Dan Prado heard through that open line, well, it terrified him. He could hear the fear in Kendy's voice. He could hear the defendant's voice. So he called Janie and Wendell, people that he had his own relationship with, his own friendship with, and told them, I am scared for Kendy. And so they called 911, and Wendell got a hold of Kendy on the phone. And Wendell, as he is talking to Kendy in that bathroom, what does he hear? He hears Dan Howard's voice saying, I would never hurt your daughter. And Wendell stays on the phone until law enforcement gets there. And when they get there, and you all got to watch the video, what they find is a Kendy who is barely speaking above a whisper. All she wants to do is pack a bag and get out of there. And finally, away from the defendant, as the defendant's downstairs with Deputy Broughton, Deputy Traw is able to ask Kendy, what is going on here? What do you think was going to happen? She tells him, he was going to kill me. She doesn't say it just once, she says it several times. Downstairs, the defendant, relaxed on the couch, doesn't understand why everybody's there. And so Kendy is walked out by the deputy. She gets in her car and she calls Dan Prado. They talk for almost an hour. And she tells him all of those same details. She calls Michelle Lampert. They talk for almost half an hour. Tells Michelle all those details. Her story is consistent. She gets down to Camei. She talks with her parents. Wendell, he goes and gets his own 380 magazine clip, tosses it on the floor. And Kendy says, yes, that's what I saw on the floor. But when I went back to look for it, it was gone. The defendant, meanwhile, well, he is blowing Kendy's phone up, texting her saying this was all a big misunderstanding, telling her that she's safe here. He doesn't stop there, though. Over the next course of that day, he calls Kendy 23 times. 16 times between 6 a.m. and 10:30. And then 7 more times later that day. sending her message after message, telling Kendy, love with a changed man, what's not to love, sending her photos of them from happier times, all to lure her back home. Come home, this is a big misunderstanding, you're safe here. And despite her family and Dan Prado's pleas to the contrary, she does. She goes back. She tells them, look, I've got an eye appointment I've got to keep. I've got to give my notice at work. I've got to finalize this divorce. She tells them he got caught. He's not going to do anything now. And she does. She goes back. January 30th, she goes and she keeps her eye appointment and she puts in an order for 2 pairs of prescription glasses. Glasses that she will have to pick up in the future. Meanwhile, she is again still ever communicative, talking with people, and she's talking to the defendant. And around 7:33 p.m., during their conversation, she sends the defendant the listing for the house in Kendy, a listing that has Dan Prado's name on it, Dan Prado's face. That night, when she gets home, it's a different Dan, new attitude. Now he's willing to sit down, he's willing to do the paperwork with her. He seems okay. And they do. They sit down and they fill out asset division. They fill out the divorce papers. And Kendy, ever communicative, she's sending these to Dan Prado. This is what we're talking about. This is what we're doing. And in that conversation with Dan Prado asks her, what are you leveraging for the quitclaim deed for the Kendy house? That was in there too. It was part of the trade. He's hard to read Kendy's text, but he's hood with that. House part of trade, no guns, mounts, and safe for deed. That conversation indicates Kendy and the defendant talked about the Kendy house on January 30th. So February 1st, after having this conversation with the defendant the night before, Kendy moves forward. She's moving forward with this plan to divorce the defendant. She reaches out to Courtney Lambert. They talk. They set a plan. Courtney's going to come by the house on Thursday, walk through it, get the listing ready. Courtney even indicates she's got a buyer lined up for $800,000. Kendy is moving forward with this plan. Meanwhile, Dan heads down to Lucille. He stops in Lewiston, he picks up Brian, and as they are driving down, Brian testified. Brian told you that Dan pulled out his phone and showed Brian the listing of the Kendy house, that same listing that Kendy had sent to him, that same listing that had Dan Prado's face, Dan Prado's name. They talked about whether or not Kendy was having an affair. They talked about their suspicions and whether or not Dan Prado was that guy. By the time that Dan Howard talks to Detective Sergeant Lawton, he's downplaying that. Told him I didn't care much at that point. That's not what Brian said. Brian said that Dan was up pacing all night. That Dan was pacing all night, that Dan was driving erratically, that Dan was upset. February 2nd was Kendy's last day. Started out totally normal. Kendy went to work, as she did, based on her schedule. She clocked out around 4 o'clock, on schedule. Her coworkers who worked with her that day testified she didn't have any injuries to her that day that we saw. She didn't have any burns to her arm that we saw. We didn't know anything about Kendy being injured at work. And it was a good day because while Kendy was at work, down in Kendy, a home inspection was going on. And Kendy, of course, ever communicative, she's talking with Dan Prado about this. Everything is good. Home inspection went great, closing can move forward. She's also telling Dan Prado, he's still trying to hang on. Him being the defendant, not fully accepting this is happening, still pleading. But Kendy, she is resolved. She is moving forward. She is ready to keep going. She wants the house in Kendy. She wants the divorce. After work, she goes and she gets her nails done in Liberty Lake. Nina Pham testified, and he was in a good mood. No injuries to her hands, her arms. Her mom's nervous. Erase everything off the phone. Kendy stops and gets McDonald's on the way. That McDonald's is about $7 food for her. She then talks to Dan Prado on the way home. For a few minutes, he testified that she seemed good. She was in a good mood. And Kendy would go home. She would talk with her mom that evening. And what were they talking about? Mundane stuff. About the house in Kendy, decor, dressers. Things looking forward to Kendy's new future. And Dan came home from Lucille that day. Dan came home on February 2nd. And so that evening, 10:48 p.m., the 911 call comes in. And in that 911 call, Dan Howard tells the 911 operator, she's dead. She's dead, she's dead, she's gray, she has no pulse. She's cold. Dan Howard, a long-time law enforcement officer who had been to many fatal car accidents or other crime scenes, tells the 911 operator, she's dead. I checked her pulse. Yet, when the deputies get there, all of a sudden he's asking them, what's going on? What are you doing? What's happening? Acting as if he doesn't know what's going on with his wife. He's also repeatedly making vomiting noises, but they notice that there's no actual vomit. He's wailing and making crying noises, but they notice that there are no tears. They also notice that he's got fresh deodorant stains on his shirt. But he would later tell Sergeant Lawton that he took a shower around 4. And now it's well after 11. The defendant gives a version of these events. He tells Sergeant Lawton that he got back that afternoon, which we know is true. That she picked up something from the deli. Well, she got McDonald's on the way home. And then we went down there and finalized everything, but she flipped out when she realized that the house had to be liquidated, and she went upstairs. Well, they had been talking about this house. Kendy knew what she needed to do to get the house in the divorce, and it wasn't a house that she even owned yet. And so, according to the defendant, instead of going upstairs and reaching out to her realtor boyfriend, her realtor friend, her family, or anyone else, he says that he can hear the bath water running. Anyway, he says, I heard something hit the floor. Didn't sound like a shot. The same defendant, his father testified that he's completely deaf in one ear. So he is a deaf in one ear, prior law enforcement officer who was on SWAT and was a firearms instructor. He cannot recognize the sound of a gunshot going off in a small room with an open door in his house, but he can hear the bathwater running? He also goes on in his interview to tell Sergeant Lawton that, was the water still running when you went up there? No, trickling. There's a trickle. Yeah, I shut that off. Must have been going in the overflow. Did he shut off the water, or was it going in the overflow? Either way, when Deputy Wheeler got on scene, that water is not near the overflow. And again, I hear the water running, and it sounded like something hit the floor. Detectives asked him, how long was it after you heard that sound of something hit the floor? She went upstairs. An hour and a half, he says. That long? Sergeant Lawton asks. Yeah, he says. Yet, Deputy Wheeler, again, that first officer on scene, told you that when he went in that bathroom, there were bubbles in that bath, and that he held his hand by the water and it felt warm. There were other odd things that stood out to Deputy Wheeler in the beginning. One was the scene in the bathroom. There's a purse sitting on the counter. There was a gun magazine in that purse. Her phone and glasses are very neatly placed by that magazine and by that purse. Not within arm's reach of the tub, however. Downstairs, the dryer was running, and Detective Northrup would later tell you that based on this timestamp from Deputy Wheeler's body camera and the 6 minutes left on the dryer, that would have meant that that dryer was started within minutes of that 911 call being placed. In order for the defendant to be guilty of count 2 first-degree murder, malice aforethought, state must prove these elements. On or about the 2nd day of February, you know that's the date that this all happened, in the state of Idaho, at her house in Apple, the defendant engaged in conduct which caused the death of Kendy Howard. No one else in that house who caused Kendy's death, either the defendant or it's Kendy herself, as alleged by the defense. The defendant acted without justification or excuse. There's no self-defense claim here in this case. With malice aforethought, basically did he act to disregard her life? And whether that murder was willful, deliberate, and premeditated. Throughout interactions with law enforcement, both outside the house and inside the house, Dan Howard kept his face covered. No tears, no true signs of emotion that deputies could see. They looked for those tears, but they could not find them. There were lots of other things that they started to notice that just seemed strange. Like in the floor of the bedroom, there was broken glass. Deputy Coroner Lynn Acevedo, who has been to thousands of deaths, would also note that glass on the ground. Detective Euler would note when he went downstairs that the wood-burning stove was absolutely cooking. He comments on in the video that it is uncomfortably hot down there. And then there's a humidifier kettle sitting on top of that stove. Divorce paperwork still sitting there on the bar counter, but now it's changed. It's changed in that Kendy's house split is now on the paperwork. Still in Dan's handwriting, different color pen. And again, Kendy, at this point, has been well informed by attorneys, by her boyfriend, by her friend, that this house isn't an asset. This house is a debt. This is something that would have to be dealt with in the divorce through a quitclaim deed. And she didn't even own the house yet. Closing had not occurred. The body itself seems strange. The body is unnaturally positioned in the tub. Her feet are scrunched up at the bottom. There's no splatter on the hands from holding the gun. And as Randy Beasley told you, what little blood is there on the body? Well, it's moving against gravity. It's moving in the wrong direction. It's curling up and around her nose, up her cheek, and on her breast. It's moving down with gravity, but then over. And Beasley told you that was indicative of a body that had moved. And as law enforcement goes through this scene, they are finding more and more things that indicate to them that this scene is staged. Small details like the fact that the shampoo and conditioner bottles are facing out of the tub. Details like the fact that the purse, the cell phone are not in reach of the tub. The fact that there's no towels within reach of the tub other than those decorative towels. That there's no clothes in the bathroom for Kendy to change into. There's bubbles. The temperature of the bath is warm. The body itself looks strange. Later, they would find out that Dan's DNA was not on those bullets in that magazine in the tub, but it was on the bullets in the magazine in the purse. Overall, there are lots of things about that scene that cause investigators to say to themselves, this doesn't look right. Well, very quickly after Kendy's body was removed from the tub, she was taken to Spokane for her autopsy. There's a lot of evidence about how long Kendy sat in that tub, but then her autopsy was 11 o'clock that next morning. About 11:30 is when it got started. And John Howard, at the end of his career, got a body, and he looked at that body, and he saw an obvious cause of death, a gunshot wound to the mouth. And he told you that it's important to document injuries. Yet, he did not document injuries. He didn't even document the injuries that he noted in his report. Didn't bother to take pictures of them. Just did a very superficial examination. He also told you that he did not review crime scene pictures, then or now. He didn't review any of the investigation, then or now. He didn't review any of the additional work that had been done by investigators in this case. And then Lynn Acevedo, few days at the funeral home, she sees Kendy's body laying out and she thinks, whoa. Looking at that body does not look like a body just committed suicide. And ultimately, through the autopsy photos, through Lynn Acevedo's photos, through the review by other medical doctors, this is what Kendy Howard's body looks like. Each of those dots is an injury to Kendy's body. Sure, maybe 1-2 bruises could be from tripping over a box at work, but not this. Part of what you have to consider in your deliberations is malice. Malice is expressed when there is a manifested, deliberate intention unlawfully to kill a human being. Malice is implied when the killing results from an intentional act. The natural consequences of that act are dangerous to human life, and the act is deliberately performed with knowledge of that danger and the conscious disregard of human life. Ladies and gentlemen, the state would argue to you that both are present in this case. The actions of the defendant demonstrate a deliberate intention to kill Kendy Howard, express malice, and the actions taken by the defendant to asphyxiate Kendy Howard, knowing how dangerous that conduct was, is implied malice. Ladies and gentlemen, you have both. Malice aforethought simply means it does not imply there has to be a deliberation or lapse of time. It simply means that the malice must precede. So did Kendy Howard die of a gunshot wound? Even at the scene, this is Kendy Howard at the scene in a body bag. That is bruising to her neck, seen still later at the funeral home. And Dr. Smock told you that bruising on that part of the neck is consistent with a rear naked choke, consistent with a carotid restraint, consistent with a type of move that could result in complete occlusion of blood flow to the brain, which would result in a lap petechia. Dr. Smock also talked about her jaw. Her jaw that was broken, fractured on the left side into multiple pieces, here and here. And that there was bruising, even at the time of autopsy, you can see it in other photos as well, from that. Dr. Smock told you, bruising occurs in life. It can show up after death, but bruising occurs in life. That fracture is the result of blunt force trauma that occurred before her death. Gary Tollison talks to you about the carotid restraint as a police technique, what it is, when it's been taught, how it's utilized. It is lethal force. And it's lethal force because officers have to know that it can kill somebody. And Leslie Lehman told you that when she was a trooper with Dan Howard showed her how to do that move. Taught her. They did it together and they talked about carotid restraint. Because again, ladies and gentlemen, this move is the carotid restraint. This is a chokehold that crushes the windpipe. This blocks blood flow. But Dr. Smock pointed out that there are other signs of asphyxiation to Kendy Howard. The fact that she has damage to her lip, the fact that she has damage to this side of the lip caused by her teeth being pushed in, the fact that she's got bruising to her nose, and again the bruising to the neck. These are the results of pressure in Kendy Howard's body, bruised in pattern form, bruised in protected areas. And again, ladies and gentlemen, many of these bruises, and these are bruises, not validity, are captured because Lynn A. Sabito had the forethought to take these photographs at the funeral home, not because Dr. Howard took photos during his autopsy. Dr. Howard didn't even take a photo of the backside of the body. It wasn't covered in blood. And then, of course, there are the lacerations. There are lacerations to the feet, consistent with walking on broken glass, lacerations to the hand, and as has been excessively discussed in this case, not the slide bite. And then there is the burn to her arm, the burn seen at autopsy and then later at the funeral home. Dr. Howard would have you believe that that is skin slippage. Well, Dr. Stewart, whose specialty is burns, who is at a level 1 trauma center in Seattle, who routinely examines potential burns through telemedicine, told you, no, that is a thermal burn caused by a hot liquid. Where is there a source of hot liquid hot enough to burn this into a second-degree burn? Well, down by the stove, sitting on top. But what else Dr. Stewart told you is that second-degree burns are actually the most painful kind of burn. Third-degree burns, you burn right through those nerve endings, but second-degree, like this, you're just exposing all those nerve endings. And a person with a second-degree burn like this is not going to go stick her arm in a bubble bath. Now again, Dr. Howard pointed out some skin slippage on that foot, but not on the other foot. And he told you that slippage occurs when there's pressure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as Dr. Smock pointed out today, this arm, and again, it's that underside of the arm, there's no pressure there. That arm on the side is up against the tub, but where that burn is, it's floating in the water, not skin slippage. And trajectory. Yes, many intraoral gunshot wounds are suicide. But most of those intraoral gunshot wounds go up to the brain to kill the person. They have an upward trajectory. And as Dr. Desmoulin talked about, an upward trajectory is a more ergonomical trajectory for someone attempting to shoot themselves. Downward trajectory is associated with homicide. It's associated with someone else holding the firearm and shooting into the person's mouth. And although Dr. Howard and Dr. Desmoulin quibbled and tried to avoid the question, they both ultimately agreed that is a downward trajectory. Dr. Van Buren talks to you about the tongue. And it's right. Dr. Howard did a good thing when he saved that tongue. He saved something of evidentiary value. And despite his proclamations that he saved lots of tongues, he saved this one, and it allowed Dr. Nard to examine it. And when she examined it, what did she find? Well, she found soot, because it was a contact wound. She found that there was some hemorrhage in the tongue, but not nearly as much as she would have expected to see. And there were all these vessels that wound path, that bullet path transected. And Dr. Van Buren told you, had her heart still been beating at the time that all of those blood vessels were transected, it would have been profound and pulsated blood loss. John Howard told you that blood can go in 3 places. It can go into the stomach, but there was no blood in the stomach. It can go into the lungs, but there's no blood in the lungs. Or it can go into the environment. Kendy Howard's heart at a C2 transection would have interrupted the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. And as Dr. Van Buren explained to you, as well as other doctors, even Dr. Desmoulin this morning, the heart can continue to beat. Now, Dr. Desmoulin tried to point you to a case study where there was some sort of shutdown of the heart. Yet, when you pushed on that case study, well, that gun, that shot, went up through the soft palate and landed in a different part. Sort of. Dr. Howard told you that when he looked at Kendy's body, without any additional information, it looked like other bodies that he'd seen. I determined that this gun, in the absence of evidence of any other cause of death, was the cause of death. Kendy Howard had been alive when that shot went through her mouth, it would have killed her. 100%. Without someone immediately intubating her and getting her to a hospital, she would have died from that shot. But Dr. Howard did not consider the other evidence. Dr. Howard did not consider everything else that indicated that at the time that that shot went through Kendy Howard's mouth, she was already dead. Dr. Desmoulin, as well, he told you that, well, if she was already dead, then she couldn't commit suicide. But he had run through all of these different scenarios that looked at whether or not it was possible that she could have shot herself, assuming she was alive. And so many of them he had to eliminate because it was impossible for the trigger to be pulled due to the strangeness of the wrist, because it was not ergonomic to hold the gun in that fashion. Because the trajectory was wrong. And Dr. Desmoulin, coming to his conclusion that it was biomechanically possible that she could have hypothetically shot herself, did not review the injuries in this case. He did not consider she was already dead. Ladies and gentlemen, you have more information than John Howard had. You have more information than Dr. Desmoulin considered. You have the benefit of all of the information from the scene, from the autopsy, from the 2-year investigation that followed. And all of that leads to the conclusion the defendant staged this to look like a suicide. And part of how you know that are all of the inconsistencies that he told law enforcement. That Kendy killed herself over a house she didn't own, that she went upstairs and killed herself without even reaching out to anyone to say, hey, is he right? Can he really force me to split this house? No, according to the defendant, she just went upstairs and did it. He claimed that he gave Kendy a loaded gun, but didn't know one was in the chamber. Well, it's true that he gave Kendy, according to the records, the evidence, that he did give Kendy a gun about 10 years prior, and Wyatt testified that he observed her shoot it once, maybe twice, and that was back when the defendant was still at ISP, so at least 5 years before this. And so Kendy would have had to have possessed a gun that was kept in a safe that she didn't have access to, and she would have chosen that as her method to kill herself. Benny told you that Kendy didn't have any life insurance. April Tarpley told you that she did. Defendant didn't say anything about blood on his hands, didn't say anything about water on the clothes, even though the bath mat was soaked. Claimed that he did not care if Kendy was having an affair. Brian said different. But he even went farther than that, ladies and gentlemen. He knew that law enforcement was looking closely at this, and so he created this document here. He gave it to law enforcement along with all her pill bottles. Stan's handwriting. He wrote, Kendy's Prozac prescriptions found for major depression. Well, just looking at the bottles, the Prozac bottles, shows you that they were prescribed for compulsive overeating. Mr. Miller told you that it was the lowest dose, that it was strictly to make the phentermine work better, and that she would never prescribe Kendy that. Moreover, the only person who thought Kendy needed meds, or who at least repeatedly told Kendy that she needed meds, was the defendant. Kendy didn't think she did. Sergeant Lawton asked Dan several times about whether or not he had gunshot residue on his hand. Not because Detective Lawton thought that he would be able to test the defendant's hands, because he knew that was not a valid test, to see the defendant's reaction. And so the defendant had this story about popping off some rounds and changing out some sights, yet that gun didn't show signs of being recently shot, and the sights were standard factory. Ladies and gentlemen, you were asked, in order to find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, whether or not there was premeditation. Premeditation does not require that you find that the defendant was already thinking about this back on January 29th. Although, the state would argue he probably was. You don't have to find that he was thinking about it when he was down in Lucille. Though the state would argue that he probably was. Premeditation only requires that it was reflected upon before the decision was made. You could have made that decision that night during whatever conversation they had. Now, if you find there was not premeditation, then you should and can still consider whether or not it would be murder in the second degree without that premeditation. But in this case, ladies and gentlemen, the state would argue there is significant evidence of premeditation on the part of the defendant. The state has argued to you that a big part of why the defendant murdered Kendy was money. We know from their messages that money was something that the defendant cared about. And after Kendy's death, well, the defendant acted in accordance with that same motivation. That hot tub that she purchased, well, within days of her death, he was contacting the seller, getting the deposit back, getting that refund. He contacted Bank of America and called fraud on her legitimate charges that she made in life. That was also not ultimately found to be true fraud charges. Courtney Lampert offered the defendant $2,000 for Kendy's special glass chicken collection. But no, on her birthday, the defendant sold Kendy's possessions in the yard to strangers. And when Brooke showed up to try and get some of her mother's possessions, she was battered by her brother and trespassed by her father. She walked away with nothing. Question, ladies and gentlemen, is whether or not Dan could have staged the scene. Could he have shot Kendy through the mouth to throw off investigators, to throw off Dr. Howard? Could he have made this murder look like a suicide? He told Dean Lampert he could. He bragged about it at a barbecue. Dan Howard was an ex-Marine. He was trained in that carotid restraint. He knew the dangers of that hold, the lethality of it. And he had worked in law enforcement for a very long time, not just as a trooper, although troopers go to many fatal scenes, but beyond that, in SWAT, firearms instructor, offensive tactics instructor, and with knowledge of DNA, fingerprints, ballistics. Dan Howard was capable of making this murder look like a suicide at first glance. The more you look at this evidence, the more it leads you to the truth. The beginning of this case my co-counsel, Mr. Mortensen, told you that there are 5 manners of death: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. Kendy Howard did not die of natural causes. Kendy Howard's death was not an accident. Ladies and gentlemen, the state has shown you, both in terms of who Kendy Howard was, and her passion for life, her plans for the future, and her engagement with her friends and her family, this was not suicide. And the state showed you that this was not suicide because a dead person cannot shoot themselves in the mouth. And because Kendy Howard did not commit suicide, this case is not undetermined.